It's 1 minute after the hour of 8 o'clock, 1 minute after the hour of 8 o'clock, and we're going to dive right into our main interview this morning. And we have on our Zoom link, of course, His Excellency Sir Ronald Sanders. Let me just make sure he's in with us. Good morning, sir. Hello, good morning.
Yes, good morning.
Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. Let me just remind our listeners, of course, that Sir Ronald Sanders is the current ambassador extraordinary and plenipotentiary to the United Nations and to the Organization of American States since 2015. And he's also the non-resident High Commissioner to Canada since 2017. Sir Ron Sanders also currently chairs the Permanent Council of the Organization of American States, OAS. Good morning, Sir Ron.
Good morning again.
Great, and congratulations on your chairmanship. Let's start with that a little bit. What are some of the hot button issues that you're hoping to tackle as chairman of the Permanent Council?
Well, last week we tackled the questions of guns, gangs, and violence, three things that affect almost every country in the Americas, and getting worse, frankly. The participation of organized crime in fostering and promoting guns and gangs and violence is increasing exponentially across the region. Mm-hmm. The number of homicides that we are seeing as a result of people with guns is also increasing across our countries. It has become a very worrying phenomenon. What is becoming even more clear is that some of these gangs are better armed than the policemen in the states in which they are operating. Mm-hmm. More than that, they're operating across borders, so that we should not believe that gangs operate in silos in Antigua alone. Mm-hmm. They may have links to other places, St. Kitts Nevis, Dominica, even as far as Jamaica and Haiti. With these links, they are organized, they're network, and unfortunately, our police forces operate in silos, not connected in the same way that the gangs are connected, and not also resourced to the extent that the gangs are resourced. Mm-hmm. So we've got a mounting problem, and it's one that we've got to watch very carefully. Mm-hmm. If not, we may find ourselves in a situation, hopefully not as bad as Haiti, in which gangs end up controlling the country and terrorizing it and running riot all over it. But maybe as bad as Jamaica, where gangs have been traditionally a problem and continue to defy law enforcement agencies and increase every year. Mm-hmm. They disrupt the society, they lure young people into these gangs from school age, and they foster a culture of violence and of rejection of the social norms, because disruption suits them. It's what makes their lawlessness possible.
Right. We know you're having a meeting. I think it's today, dealing with another issue there, and we certainly wish you all the very best, and we look forward to your just keeping us up to date as to what is happening there. Let's turn our attention now to the territorial border disputes between Guyana and Venezuela. The territorial border dispute between both of these countries revolves around the Essequibo region, a large area of land that both countries claim. And you are uniquely able to give us a backstory as to how this all began and where we are presently. Let's dive a little into that, sir.
It's a long story, but it started in 1897.
Right.
And it started in 1897 when the Venezuelans, the Brazilians, and the United Kingdom wanted to settle the boundaries between them in the South American area. Mm-hmm. Now, an arbitral award committee was established. Venezuela nominated the Chief Justice of the United States of America as its representative on the arbitration.
Mm-hmm.
The United Kingdom appointed its Chief Justice as its representative on the arbitration. And between the two of them, they selected the chairman of the commission. And they selected at that time the president of the Supreme Court of Russia as the chairman. Now, remember, in 1897, Russia is not what we know Russia is today.
Right.
It was very much a part of the capitalist West. It was ruled by a czar. So it was not, this is pre-revolutionary Russia. So in any event, all three of these men were highly schooled in the law. They had the benefit of a team of surveyors and cartographers, people skilled in mapping countries and deciding what should be the landmarks that would be the points at which the border would be fashioned, and looking, of course, at the natural terrain. Anyway, in 1897, this arbitral award was set up, and for 2 years, it diligently did its work. And at the end of that 2-year period, in 1899, it made an arbitral award. Now, in that arbitral award, the largest piece of land that was up to then under British administration was awarded to Venezuela. Venezuela got the entire Orinoco area. The entire Orinoco area, incidentally, is larger than Guyana is at the moment. So the award was favorable to Venezuela. And Venezuela at that time proclaimed the award because they got the Orinoco. It was a very important area, both for shipping and, of course, the amount of land that was involved. They proclaimed this as a victory. And they went to their parliament and they ratified the agreement in parliament in 1897 and said this was wonderful. And so it remained until 1961. And in 1961, the then president of Venezuela, out of the clear blue sky, decided that Venezuela had been robbed in the arbitration award, and that really they should have had territory going into what is now Guyana and taking in the entire Essequibo region. Now, I'm sorry we don't have a map that we could show to see if they took Essequibo, what would be left of Guyana. It would be a very thin strip of land running down that top part of South America, but certainly not the territory that we know today. In any event, out of the clear blue sky, he claimed that that Essequibo was theirs. Now, you have to understand what was happening at the time that led him to this claim. First of all, he was a right-wing president, and something had just happened in the Caribbean that shook up all the right-wing leaders. A man called Fidel Castro came down from the mountains of the Sierra Maestra to take control of Cuba and to kick out a corrupt dictator called Batista. Now, when Castro did that, it sent the shivers down the spines of all of these right-wing leaders who had been running their countries like fiefdoms. And he decided, just as is happening now, not only did he need a distraction for the Venezuelan people from the difficulties they were going through, but he also needed to try to see if he could light a spark under the United States government to pull them into his side in saying that he had a claim to Essequibo. So he put it to the President of the United States at the time, John F. Kennedy, and also to the British Prime Minister, a man called Harold Macmillan at the time.
Right.
And he said to them, look, we've just had this phenomenon of communist rise in Fidel Castro in Cuba, and you're about to get another communist government right here in your backyard in Guyana. And what was happening in Guyana at that time was Guyana was heading toward independence. In fact, Guyana was the country that was ahead in the struggle for independence
Right.
in the entire Caribbean. But its leader was a man called Dr. Cherry Jagan. And Jagan was suspected by the British and the Americans of others of being a Marxist, Leninist, and a communist, and somebody who would create a communist state in Guyana. As it turned out, when Jagan did become president many years later, he did no such thing. The country continued along the same path that it always had, with no sign of any Russian control or being used as a base for communist activity or any of the kind. But in any event, that was this bogeyman that he raised at the time. Now, Kennedy flatly rejected it, and so did Macmillan. What he wanted them to do was to join in him in seizing the Essequibo so that they could develop it together. That was the promise he made. They would have control of the territory, but the United States and the United Kingdom would have control of the exploitation of its resources. It's rich in minerals, in all sorts of things: gold, bauxite, silver, base, aluminium, you name it. And that was the plan. Anyway, they both rejected it. He then said that this is the president of Venezuela, that some young attorney who was a part of this, who was the bag carrier during the arbitral award work by the three distinguished judges, had died. And they found in his papers a note in which he claimed that he believed that the United States Supreme Court judge, the appointee of Venezuela, was bribed by the Chief Justice of the United Kingdom in order to come up with this arbitral award that did not give them Essequibo. That is the claim. Let me make it clear. That is the claim. And that is what Venezuela has been saying since 1961. It may sound to you farcical. Indeed, I think it sounds farcical to anybody who hears the story for the first time.
Right. Because
Venezuela does not put the matter in the way that I have just told you, but that in fact is what it really is. They have no claim to Guyana because the 1899 award was very clear. It set the boundaries of the countries. And remember that it's just not the boundaries of Guyana and Venezuela, but also the boundary of Brazil.
Right.
Because what would happen is if the Venezuelans take over the Essequibo, all of a sudden, Brazil would be surrounded by Venezuela. It already shares a border area with Venezuela, but if the Essequibo is removed, it will be surrounded by Venezuela. Something which worries the Brazilians considerably, which is, even though they too had a claim to a part of Essequibo, they conceded it in the arbitral award because for them it was better to have Guyana as a neighbor on a border than it was to be surrounded by Venezuela.
Right.
But in any event, at the award in 1899, Venezuela got the largest share of territory. It got the Orinoco. It was happy with it at the time. The boundary of Brazil was settled with Guyana, and Guyana's boundaries were set. As you and I are now speaking, Winston, what is law, international law, and legally recognized throughout the world is the 1899 award,
right,
in which the boundaries of Guyana are exactly what they are, and Venezuela has the Orinoco as part of its territory. So, eventually, the United Kingdom, Guyana, and Venezuela had a meeting in 1966 in Geneva, at which they tried to look at ways in which they could try to settle peacefully this continuing claim that Venezuela was making in defiance of the law. And they agreed under the Geneva Agreement that as soon as Guyana became independent, and that was in the same year, this meeting was in late 1965, but the agreement came into being in 1966 when Guyana became independent in May. Now, the agreement was that they would set up first a mixed commission between Guyana and Venezuela. which would try to look at ways in which they could settle this claim, or even be helpful to each other in all sorts of possibilities were talked about, including Guyana opening an access to the Atlantic Ocean for Venezuela by giving it a strip of land that would allow it to do that. That was one possibility. They talked about several things, and those talks went on for, the Mixed Commission went on for about 8 years with no success. Venezuelans would not agree to anything that was put on the table. Eventually, a kind of truce was agreed, in which for 10 years they would put this matter in abeyance. And so it went into abeyance for 10 years. And during that peaceful period, nothing happened. Then, unfortunately, the Venezuelans cranked this up again, and 3 United Nations Secretaries General sent good offices fellows to Guyana and Venezuela to try to mediate and facilitate a solution. Right. One of those people was the late Sir Alistair McIntyre, who, as you'll recall, was a vice chancellor of the University of the West Indies. Right. And before that, he was the Secretary General of CARICOM. Anyway, all of that failed. And what the agreement said, this is the 1966 Geneva Agreement now, what it said was that if all of these attempts failed, the parties would leave the means of settlement of the dispute to the Secretary General of the United Nations. And that is what they decided to do. Secretary General of the United Nations then appointed the International Court of Justice, which is a United Nations body registered in its charter as the organ at which this matter should be settled, and invited both countries to take their case to the International Court of Justice for settlement. That was in 2017. In 2018, Guyana proceeded to put its case before the International Court of Justice. Right. Venezuela said it did not recognize the jurisdiction of the court, and it was not going. It was an odd claim by Venezuela that they did not recognize the jurisdiction of the court, because every country that becomes a member of the United Nations, and Venezuela is a member of the United Nations, under Article 33 of the Charter of the United Nations, when you become a member of the UN, you automatically become subject to the International Court of Justice. Right. That is in the Charter. So if you sign up to the Charter, you signed up to the court. Nonetheless, that was their position. Having said that, however, when the case did begin, Venezuela sent a battery of lawyers and several of their ministers to Geneva, where the case was being heard, and made representation to the court that it had no jurisdiction, piles of legal paper. And the court entertained that submission, gave it due notice, and then ruled that they indeed did have jurisdiction, and they therefore were going to proceed with the case. Right. Venezuela, again, tried to derail that process, and again, it failed. This is a court of very distinguished judges from all over the world, and they said, no, we have jurisdiction, we'll hear the case. So Guyana submitted its case. Venezuela submitted counter-arguments, but not as claiming all the time that they were not participating in the court, right. That they don't recognize the jurisdiction, that they were only trying to be helpful. But the case is now coming to a close. Next year, in April, the court will hand down its decision. And the suspicion is, by all the people who have followed this saga over these many, many years, is that the Venezuelans are terrified that their case is so flimsy that the court is going to find in favor of Guyana and will rule that the existing 1899 arbitral award was indeed fair and final and just, and that those boundaries should remain. Now, that is why what Venezuela has been doing is saying, we don't recognize the court, we don't want to go to the court, what we want to do is to have bilateral discussions with Guyana so that we could come to a settlement of this matter, ignoring completely that for some 30 or 40 years before that, that is precisely what was happening, with no result. So why they think any better result would come now when it didn't for 4 decades is a matter that only they in Caracas could answer. Now, they are trying to divide the countries of CARICOM by saying that CARICOM should become a broker in this matter, should push Guyana to the table to talk with them bilaterally, because, of course, what's wrong with dialogue? Well, what's wrong with dialogue is that you've tried it. You know, it's like talking to your I'm trying to think what's a good example. It's like trying to talk to your child about why certain of its habits are not in its interest.
Right.
And you talk and you talk and you talk, and it goes nowhere because the child just does the same thing over and over again. At some point, the parent has to act. And if not, there will be total disruption and chaos, and who knows where that would end up. So they're trying to divide CARICOM, which has always been strongly in favor of Guyana's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and for very good reason, which includes the interests of the CARICOM countries.
Right.
They're trying to divide them to get Guyana to be pushed to the table. Well, if you have a case before the court, think about it in your own personal terms. If you have a case before the court, a court that it's quite likely you will win, and the person who's making a claim against you says, man, forget your court case. Come, let's sit down and talk. You know, we can work this thing out together. And he has deeper pockets than you, and he's stronger than you. This is your bird in the hand. The question is, would you give it up for a bird in the bush?
Right.
And clearly the answer to that is no. Guyana believes that this case does really need to be settled by an international court on the international law, and so that it can reaffirm its boundaries in the eyes of everybody else. Now, the truth is, if that settlement were to come about, it would benefit both Guyana and Venezuela, even though Venezuela doesn't see it that way. Because what it would do is to put an end to this constant bickering that Venezuela does over whether it owns Essequibo or not, and could lead to a situation in which two friendly countries sitting next to each other with vast resources can now say, okay, we no longer have any dispute between us. In what ways can we, as good neighbors, develop these resources that we have jointly, collectively? Let's bargain with the oil companies together instead of bargaining with them separately. Let's try to get better agreements, better arrangements for our people. And at the same time, they might even look at the Caribbean area and say, you know, let's see how best we could help jointly our neighbors. Now, all of that would be great for the Caribbean. It would continue to maintain us as a zone of peace, but it would give all of the region an opportunity to exploit resources which are in the Caribbean and which could be beneficial to everybody.
Right.
But look, that's me. I'm a peacemaker. I'm a mediator. I'm somebody who always looks for the right solution.
Right.
There are people in this world, however, who are motivated by other things, political power, avarice, greed, the need to, and in Venezuela, they have made the Essequibo a kind of credo. Every child growing up in Venezuela for the last 60 years has had it drilled into their heads that Essequibo belongs to Venezuela. If you look at their school exercise books, the map of Venezuela shows the Essequibo as part of Venezuela. They've grown up with that, this idea that it is somehow being stolen from them. And if you ingrain that thought in people's minds for 60 and more years, there is no way in which they can change from that. Not unless they themselves have studied this situation, gone to university, looked at all of the back papers, understand what this is about, and there are Venezuelans who do know. Then, because it is such a kind of national credo, no political party in Venezuela can say, look, we know this is nonsense. because if they do that, they may lose some popular vote from
That's right.
people who, in whose heads they've ingrained that this is theirs.
Right.
So the political parties are united in Venezuela on nothing except that Essequibo belongs to.
At least
That
there's
is
one
the
point.
only thing they're agreed on. And so they meet for mediation talks. They met in Mexico, they met in Barbados, everywhere they meet. And the one thing they can come out and say is, we agree Essequibo is ours. Agree on anything else? Absolutely nothing. And in the meantime, the people of Venezuela are suffering. Venezuela now has 7.2 million Venezuelans living outside of Venezuela, people who have fled from the country because they can't get medicines, they can't get food, they can't get transportation. And these people have populated countries in Latin America, in Colombia, in Peru, in Brazil, even in Guyana. They've been arriving in Guyana in large numbers, and Guyana has been keeping them, giving them a living there.
Right.
They've gone down as far as Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes.
And of course, they're going across from Colombia through the Darien Gap into Panama, up to Mexico, and are now standing on the U.S. border as well.
Right.
So here are people who are besieged. And instead of trying to look at how you can improve their situation, you're calling upon them to go to a referendum, to answer 5 questions, all of which are programmed questions. They're biased questions. They all have one answer, yes. And so the slogan in Venezuela is yes 5 times, because they've got 5 questions and they want 5 yeses. And what is that designed to do? To make people say, Essequibo is ours. It belongs to us. Well, let's assume you get that through. What's your next step? You have a referendum. You get the people to say that Essequibo belongs to you. What's your next step?
Well, I think this is a good point to inject that whilst Venezuela and Guyana remains close allies, close partners within CARICOM, that some Caribbean leaders are in fact paying very close attention. I just want to read this to you and to get your response at the back end of it. As early as last week, regional leaders have been weighing in on the escalating tensions between Guyana and Venezuela. The latest, of course, is the Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados at the Barbados Labour Party's annual conference last weekend called on Guyana and Venezuela to ensure that there is a peaceful end to the land controversy between them. She was reported in the Starbrook News as exhorting the two countries to make certain that the Caribbean remained a zone of peace. And I quote, "I hope that the rhetoric and the noise between Venezuela and Guyana does not turn our Caribbean into anything that is not a zone of peace, because it matters to us that the Caribbean remains a zone of peace." And that, of course, was captured by the Barbados Today. How important do you think is the peace that she's referring to, the Caribbean island leaders, and they continue to talk about? Are we heading to a test of regional capacity in finding a solution or certain conflict? Where do you feel the tensions, the vibrations coming from?
Well, there is no role for CARICOM in any of this,
okay,
except a role to which they may be invited to play.
Right.
Because this is an issue between two sovereign nations,
right,
between Guyana on the one hand and Venezuela on the other. And the matter is in the court, the highest court in the world. Anything that Guyana does or Venezuela does will be prejudicial to those court hearings. And when Prime Minister Motley calls for a peaceful settlement, but surely that is exactly what's happening now. By going to the International Court of Justice and putting the matter before the highest court in the world under international law, the body that has all the competence to settle this matter peacefully, that's precisely what is happening. That's what's happening, at least on the Guyana side. And as for the noise that Prime Minister Motley, to which Prime Minister Motley referred, I have to assume that she's talking about the noise coming out of Venezuela, because it is Venezuela which has called for a referendum within Venezuela on somebody else's territory. That referendum is akin to this. Let's assume we hold a referendum tomorrow in Antigua, and we decide that St. Kitts Nevis is part of Antigua. And we asked the people of Antigua, do you agree that we should take St. Kitts Nevis as part of our country because of X, Y, Z? 5 questions. And our people say, yes, let's take it. Let's take it. I mean, jokingly, an ambassador said to me yesterday, an ambassador from a Caribbean country, he says, I quite like the Grenadines. I think I'll hold a referendum with my people and see if they can't agree that we should take it. I mean, it's as ridiculous as that. You can't hold a referendum in your country to decide that your country has the right to seize somebody else's. That's just stage managing. It's circus. The only way you can get territory is one or two ways. It's either you go to a court and establish a case that the territory is yours and the court awards it to you. It's like a land dispute between two neighbors over in Antigua.
Right.
You're not happy with your demarcation. You go to the court and you say, look, this man moved the line from here to there. My land is expected. And the court decides based on the facts.
Right.
Or you can take arbitrary action. You can simply say, to hell with everything else. I'm going to build my fence where I think my fence should be. And so it is the latter that's happening here. But the matter is before the court. And the people who are putting soldiers on the border are not Guyana right now. Soldiers are going on the Venezuelan border. And you have to, and that is a sinister move. Because the army and military equipment of Venezuela is far superior to anything that Guyana could mount. I think at most Guyana probably has 100,000 soldiers. Venezuela, by the same token, probably have over 1 million. So, and plus all the armaments and the guns and the battleships and the aircraft carriers and so on. So the noise, I think, is being mistakenly saying that it's a noise between. The noise is only coming from one place.
Right. Well, we will certainly keep tracking this. Let me ask you this final question, and then we'll take a break. And on the next side of the break, we'll dive right into the internal happenings over there in Haiti. This dispute between both of these two Caribbean countries remain unresolved as of yesterday, right? Or this morning as we speak. It continues to be a complex and sensitive matter. You have clearly defined both sides as I know it to be, and I'm sure many persons would. In your expert opinion, do you have faith in both countries that they will find a working solution to this issue? And I'm sure as the IC, as the International Court of Justice probably will hand down its own ruling. Do you think that both countries will find a working solution?
Well, that was the solution, to go to the International Court of Justice, the arbitral body that would make the decision on whether or not the 1899 award, which continues to exist, is valid, and therefore settle the land boundaries between these two countries. That's what anybody would do if they had a land dispute between themselves in Antigua. They would go to a court and get the court to decide whether the boundaries between the two properties are accurate. And if they're not, they would tell them to shift it. If it's accurate, they will give a judgment.
Right.
That's the peaceful way of doing it, and that is precisely the approach that Guyana has been using, and it has been doing so. Remember, with the under the imprimatur of the United Nations Secretary General, who it is in 2017 decided that the way for the peaceful settlement was to go to the International Court of Justice.
Right.
As to whether Guyana will do anything else other than that, my point is Guyana cannot do anything else other than that. It hasn't got the military capacity to do anything else. It will try to defend itself, of course, but it all depends on what Venezuela does. It's a far bigger country. It's 10 times the size of Guyana or more. It has an army that is at least 100 times larger than Guyana's. So it really, the matter of whether peace continues to be the way in which you proceed on this is really down to how the Venezuelans want to play it.
Right.
what actions they've taken so far are worrying, particularly the fact that they're holding a referendum in their own country amongst their own people to decide whether they have a right to seize somebody else's territory, because that's what they're doing now. Remember, the 1899 arbitral award is what is in place internationally.
Right.
It's the boundaries that are respected by everybody internationally.
Right. All right. Your Excellency, we've run clear out of time, and one of the things I'm going to have a conversation with you about is having a master class on foreign policy, because once we get started, of course, there's just so many areas to cover in such short time. I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and we certainly do look forward to having you back again. Your explanations, your understanding of the issues in relation to Venezuela and Guyana were absolutely on point, and of course this whole issue in relation to Haiti. Thank you so much, sir, and we look forward to having you again.
Thank you very much, Winston. Have a good day. Good to see you.
Very
and good
same
morning to all of your audience.
Yes, thank you so much. Always happy to have you. Always happy to have you.